If you like a little bit hot, you put the chili powder inside, yeah. And then you add the bean sprouts and chive. Actually, we use chive. In Bangkok, we use chive. But here, we not available. We use spring onion. But the chive tastes better.
Good afternoon. We are now moving into our feature session of the panel of women in WACS. And this really consists of a two-part presentation. One will be a presentation by Ann Cooper, who is going to tell us why a woman's place is in the kitchen. And Ann is the author of 4 books, including by the title of her presentation, namely A Woman's Place is in the Kitchen. She's Director of Nutrition Services for U.S. School District in California. So she's basically on the forefront of transforming U.S. school luncheons to something a lot more nutritious. And I understand you're having some challenges, which is not surprising, because kids come to you after they have been already conditioned to fast food and what have you. So it's a very challenging position. And also is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America, worked as executive chef, and is on the board of the Women Chefs and Restaurateurs in America. And after Ann gives her presentation, we will have a panel discussion. And we have Sirkka Ruutinen, who is the chef to the President of Finland. And we have, let's see, no, I got the wrong sequence. We have Anna Jacob, who is a nutritionist from Singapore. And we have Madhi Krishnan, who just was named Chef of the Year in India, the female Chef of the Year. And we have Euda Morales, who is the director of Food Magazine and a teacher. And we have Susie Redding from Canada. Redding, it's pronounced. And she is... she's the executive chef for Calphalon, a company that sells, among other things, cookware. And we also have, let's see where we are, Antoinette Kennedy. Antoinette comes from South Africa and has her own consulting company. And then rounding out the panel will be Sandra Braun, who is from Germany, and is the only female master chef that is here at the Congress. So, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts and listen to Ann Cooper. Ann.
Thank you. Can I get turned on here, please? Turn me up. Thank you. Before I start, I want to tell you just a little bit about what I do. I'm Director of Nutrition Services for Berkeley Unified School District. I have 90 employees in 17 locations. We cook about 8,200 meals every day for kids. We have gardening classes and cooking classes. But my female executive chef and my 2 female executive sous chefs are cooking 8,200 meals a day for kids in our city. And that's what we do. And that will sort of color a lot about what I want to talk about. But before I'd get started, I'd like to say one thing. Can we have all the women chefs in this room stand up? I want to see all the women standing up. Come on, stand up, stand up, stand up. There's a couple women in this room, right? How many went up, 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 up? All right, now I want a round of applause for all the women. You know, I've been walking around this conference. I hear there's 700 people. And you know what? There's not enough women. And I hope next year and in the years to come, there are more. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got started with this and what happened when I started thinking about and learning about women in this industry. And there's me with some of the kids in our school in Berkeley. I wrote this book called A Woman's Places in the Kitchen, The Evolution of Women Chefs. And I started to try and figure out why it was that for 10,000 years, women have fed the planet and we're never at the tops of professional kitchens. How did that get to be? Women were credited with cooking with fire for the first time. Women were really the people who came up with a lot of the culinary techniques we use today. But the first cooks were men. And that was because the first cooks, people that were called cooks when it became a profession, was cooks for the armies. These men were traveling with the armies and cooking for all of the men from the armies. And there were no women in the armies and there were no women cooks. And that's how it started. And it sort of went on from there that when we didn't have armies and when all the armies went to the castles to kind of practice war, jousting and stuff, then these cooks for the knights became cooks for the kings. And all of a sudden, a profession was born. It was no longer women's work, that was something else. This is something men did, so it was deemed important, because we all know that men are important. And so, all of a sudden, being a chef was important. And all these important chefs decided, and cooks decided they needed a guild. Just like I belong to ACF, and we're all WACS, these were guilds. But you could only get into a guild two ways. One, you needed to be a son, kind of precluded women, or you had to buy your way in. And women were chattel at that point. They didn't own money, they didn't own land, so women couldn't get in guilds. And then we started seeing the real profession of chefs, and Escoffier started the brigade system. And that was really loosely based on the military. Just like our uniforms were based on the Turkish military, the whole brigade system was based on the military. And there were no women in the armies. So again, there were just no women in traditional European the European system. Yet at home in America, women were cooking. Women took care of the homes. And today, thousands of years later, women still, by and large, certainly in America, have to take care of the family. Even if you're the executive chef of a hotel, you still, by and large, are taking care of that family. So we saw these women at home taking care of the family, and we saw men being the professional chefs. But that slowly started to change. Women were cooking, starting cooking schools, writing books, but they were cooks. They weren't considered chefs. In America, we had Fannie Farmer. She started the Boston Cooking School and started writing about cooking and really started to put some scientific spin on cooking and wrote some really interesting cookbooks around this time. But she was never considered a chef. She was a cook. One of the first American chefs that was considered a chef for a woman was Edna Lewis. And in the 1940s, she was the first African-American chef in New York City, female executive chef in New York City. And she had a restaurant there in the early 40s. And she's recently deceased. But she really started the first women that we saw as chefs in in restaurants. And then there was Julia Child. Julia Child was never really a chef, although she wrote tremendous cookbooks and really changed how Americans thought about food. She went over to France, studied. She just followed her husband over there, got into food, studied it, and brought it back to America, but put it on TV. And all of a sudden, women were seen as knowledgeable about food, but still not really chefs. Madeline Kamen also came from France, and she started the Beringer School for American Chefs. She single-handedly upgraded a lot of the chefs. A lot of the young chefs in America were trained by Madeline. And she was called a chef, and she wore a chef jacket sometimes, but still, I don't think she got the professionalism. She wasn't given that due that we saw a lot of the male chefs still having. Leah Chase came out of New Orleans and kind of brought Creole cooking to Americans. And she was always in a chef's coat, and she was chef of her own restaurant. And so we started to see more of this. Now we're going into the 1960s, which wasn't that long ago, And then we finally started seeing chefs in America were also women. The Culinary Institute was started in 1945 by 2 women, yet it didn't graduate a female culinary student till 25 years after it was started in 1970. So even though it was started by women, women weren't really in CIA. This picture is of Eve Felder, who's won